Welcome to today's executive assessment versus GMAT information session through MyGuru. I'm just going to pause the recording for a moment, give folks a couple more minutes to join, and then we'll begin today's presentation here momentarily. Past our start time, we'll go ahead and begin our presentation. So, my name is Stefan Meunier, and I am MyGuru's Director of Online Instruction. And today we're going to be talking about the differences between the executive assessment and the GMAT, both of which are exams for primarily business school application that are offered by the Graduate Management Academic Council, the GMAC. So let's go ahead and just by talking about the lesser known of the two exams, the executive assessment. So the executive assessment is primarily offered and accepted by part-time and executive MBA programs. So you're primarily looking at folks that are coming into MBAs a little bit later in their career. The executive assessment has a single combined score that is on a scale of 120 to 180. Now, while the scaled score is between 120 and 180, technically, it is exceedingly unlikely that you're going to get anything or above a 170, and most scorers are going to be between a 140 and a 160. Broadly, guidance from many top programs, executive MBA, part-time MBA, is that a 155 to a 160 is kind of the score goal. And usually the cutoff at the lower end for most programs, pardon me, is a 150. So a 150 you can kind of assume is average, and above that is generally a score goal, the executive assessment. Now, the executive assessment has three 30-minute sections in a set order. You start with the integrated reasoning. There's 12 questions there. Then you have a verbal section of 14 questions and a quantitative section of 14 questions. And there is no essay on the executive assessment. The essay is definitely the least relevant portion of the GMAT for most MBA admissions offices as well. So for this exam, they completely omit the essay for the executive assessment. The reason is, every applicant to business school will have to produce some sort of statement of purpose, alternate or additional essay material, whether it's like I said, a statement of purpose, case studies, relevant information that is much more germane to the application than just some rote 30-minute essay that's under strict time consideration. So in the executive assessment, they basically eschew the essay portion entirely. GMAT, pardon me. GMAT is the preferred entrance exam for most global MBAs. It is definitely the one that gets most publicity, is publicized significantly more, and again, for full-time, is definitely preferable. If you're considering the GMAT versus executive assessment, definitely make sure that the program that you are applying to will accept the executive assessment, because even within an individual school, different programs may or may not take the GMAT versus the executive assessment. Just about every MBA program will accept the GMAT part-time or full-time. But for instance, I'm located here in Chicago, and for instance, at Northwestern's Graduate Management School, Kellogg, they may take the executive assessment for the part-time or the EMBA, but they definitely would prefer the GMAT for the standard full-time MBA. So just things to consider. The GMAT also has the more familiar combined score scale of 200 to 800, incorporates only the quantitative and the verbal sections. So the integrated reasoning is not a portion of the combined score for the GMAT, but it is for the executive assessment. Each section is approximately 60 minutes for the GMAT. You have 62 minutes for the quantitative section, 65 minutes for the verbal section. And Then you have the 30-minute essay and the 30-minute integrated reasoning sections that are outside of that 200 to 800 score. The essay and the integrated reasoning will always either be the first or the last things on your GMAT, and they are generally, again, less of a concern than that combined score out of 800 that most people are familiar with. And if you've been looking at the GMAT, you're probably familiar with score levels such as 600, 650, 700, 750, just based on their percentiles and things of that nature. Now, I will say that the essay, while the essay is, again, significantly secondary as far as the admissions offices are concerned for the GMAT, the integrated reasoning is becoming more of a concern. And part of it is because the integrated reasoning is included in the executive assessment. So integrated reasoning you don't want to completely ignore from the GMAT, but you want to instead just make sure that your integrated reasoning individual score on a scale of 1 to 8 is a comparable percentile to whatever your overall score percentile is on that scale of 200 to 800. What are some of the considerations that go into whether you should take the executive assessment or the GMAT? So we'll begin with some pros and cons for the executive assessment. Biggest pro, obviously, executive assessment is a much shorter exam. You saw it's about 90 minutes all told, instead of the nearly 3.5 hour GMAT when you take it in person. Now, there is obviously the current COVID-19 circumstances that have pushed both the executive assessment and the GMAT online. The online GMAT is a little bit shorter, but it's still significantly longer than your 90-minute executive assessment. So no matter whether you're taking the GMAT or the executive assessment at home or in a testing center, the executive assessment is purely a much shorter exam at an hour and a half in duration. Now, the biggest con for the executive assessment is that it is not accepted for all MBA programs. So if you're going to consider the executive assessment, you must do your own research to confirm that the executive assessment is accepted, not just at the school, but for the specific program that you wish to apply to. Another pro about the executive assessment is that even though it's a shorter exam, you have more time per question. So within the GMAT, you have 31 questions in 62 minutes, for instance, on the quantitative side. On the executive assessment, 14 questions in 30 minutes for both the quantitative and the verbal. So you've got a little more than 2 minutes per question in the quantitative and the verbal sections on the on the executive assessment. The integrated reasoning section is actually almost the exact same pacing, but overall, quant and verbal, you have more time per question on the executive assessment than you get on the GMAT itself, which is at 2 minutes per question on the quantitative and about 1:50 per question, a little bit under that for the verbal. So you just get more time per question on the executive assessment. Now, the just logistical cons of the executive assessment is it costs more. The reason for this is definitely something that GMAC has decided, and even though it's a shorter exam, it costs more. It's $350 for the executive assessment. It is, I believe, and double check these rates as they are always subject to change, $200 for the online GMAT, the at-home GMAT that is available at least currently through July 17, and $250 for the in-person GMAT. So the executive assessment just costs more. And then another pro to the executive assessment is that there is no geometry. So you will not have to spend your time reviewing formulas for Pythagorean theorem and volumes of cylinders or circumferences of circles. The executive assessment, that is part of the GMAT, and just generally the executive assessment quantitative section is a bit easier. The content areas minus geometry are pretty much the same: arithmetic, word problems, or basic algebra, those sorts of things. But it's definitely the case that the quantitative content on the executive assessment is generally a little bit easier. Again, though, there will be no calculator on either of these exams, so you have to prepare for manual, regardless of whether you choose the executive assessment itself. Now, a couple more cons for the exam, though. Of course, the integrated reasoning is in the overall score, so you have to pay attention to the integrated reasoning, and the integrated reasoning actually has a slight adaptive impact on your verbal sections and the overall score down the line. So just be aware of the importance of the IR. It definitely has a much greater importance in your overall scoring on the executive assessment. So you have to prepare for that a little bit differently. And the biggest secondary con for the executive assessment that people need to be aware of, there's only 2 lifetime takes allowed for this exam. So you have to be ready to take it. And there's always the possibility that this could change, but right now you get 2 shots at it. And one of the things that we frequently see in terms of preparation and tutoring is that many people are not aware of that 2 lifetime limitation. So what happens is we'll interact with a student after they've taken the first one and they didn't really do a whole lot of prep, and then it becomes a sudden like aha moment of, oh, now I really have to make sure that I'm ready for the last. So if you haven't taken one yet, that's good because you want to take those takes when you're ready to take the exam and excel on it. But something you definitely want to be aware of as a con to the executive assessment. So, considerations. And again, some pros and cons. Of course, the biggest pro about the GMAT is that it is simply the preferred exam. Whether it's the GMAT, the executive assessment, or even the GRE, the GMAT is just going to be the most highly weighted exam. So if you do better on the GMAT, it looks better than anything else. But again, there's just more prep that's probably necessary for that. And part of it is because you have a longer exam and you have longer sections. It's just the nature of it. So we talked about the timing, about 3.5 hours for the in-person testing center official GMAT, about 2.5 hours if you're looking at the at-home GMAT, because that does not include an essay. They again issue the essay in consideration of security concerns for the at-home administration. But either way, you're looking at a longer exam. One of the other pros about the GMAT is you actually get to choose the order in which you want to take the. So there are 3 options, and again, you have to have the integrated reasoning and the essay come either at the beginning or the end. And the essay either has to be the absolute first thing you do or the absolute last thing you do. But you can decide if you want quant or verbal first, or if you'd like to leave the quant and the verbal later and get the stuff that doesn't matter out of the way first. Just have a little bit more flexibility with the GMAT. Con though, it does include an essay. Now, I've been saying throughout that the essay is the least important aspect of the GMAT, but that does not mean that you don't want to attempt to do well on it, period. The scoring scale for the GMAT essay is 0 to 6 in half-point increments, and the 53rd percentile, 53rd, 54th percentile is a 5. So really, if you're taking the GMAT, you want to get a 5 or above. It's not necessarily the most difficult thing to do if you at least just spend some time doing at least a couple practice essays and understanding what the prompt is and what the task is. Should not be that difficult to, provided that you've got some background in English and writing essays at a collegiate level, to draft an essay that will be satisfactory for that 5. But you do want to make sure that you don't come out with like a 2 on that scale of 0 to 6, because then that would raise some alarms that the admissions folks would possibly want to investigate. Pro, lower cost. We already talked about this. It is just a cheaper exam. For whatever reason, the more time you spend at the testing center, the less it costs. So that's one nice thing about the GMAT. But as we've been talking about, it does require more prep. There's more content to cover on the quantitative side. Generally is just more difficult. But one of the pros that you have for is you can take it up to 5 times in a year, and as soon as 16 days after one GMAT administration, you can take it again. So you don't have that limitation of the executive assessment, whereby you have to basically know, okay, I'm ready to take this because I've only got 2 shots at it. And of course, the biggest con for the GMAT, from just a preparation standpoint, is that it is generally the more difficult exam. It just is. There's not really any sort of additional commentary necessary for that con. But there's going to be more long kind of, especially on the quantitative side, and of course, geometry a part of it as opposed to the executive assessment. So that is pretty much the what the differences are between the executive assessment and the GMAT. We've got a blog, and we've been updating it pretty frequently as news has been coming out with primarily the online at-home administration of the GMAT. Recently, everyone found out that as of, I believe, tomorrow, because I think today is the 10th. Yes, today is the 10th. The online at-home GMAT will, at long last, be allowing physical notes to be taken, whereas for the first approximate month of that offering, they were not allowing physical notes. So you had to use an online whiteboard, and that was a different just test taking experience. So you can follow us on the you can check out the blog and follow that blog, and we keep up to date on most of the news that comes out of that, as well as just general MBA notes and things of that nature. We sometimes have guest posts and things of that nature that would be potentially beneficial to folks as they consider their academic goals. And of course, you can always email questions to me at info@myguruedge.com. They come to me and everybody else on the team. So if I don't answer, someone else will. And of course, right now, if there are any questions that anybody has, we've got a chat window, and I'll just type a chat message here. If there are any questions, you can open up the chat and ask away answer. So that will just open it up to the group. Are there any questions that anyone would like to ask? Pardon me. Seems like we've got a quieter group this morning. Well, if any questions come up, again, feel free to send an email to MyGuruEdge, info@myguruedge.com, and we'll be happy to answer any personal questions you might want to ask outside of the webinar environment. And I hope that wherever you are, you're having a great day, and we look forward to potentially hearing from each of you again in the near future, as these webinars will continue on a bi-weekly basis. Our next one will be on the 24th. Thanks for joining, everyone, and have a great day.